summer series, and I'm kind of excited that I got assigned James 3 and verse 16. It's kind of one of the topics in the Bible that I'm really interested in, and that is the topic of envy. Let's turn over to James 3 and verses 14 through 16 and read together these verses. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Have you ever heard the expression that envy is the green-eyed monster? Maybe if you're familiar with Shakespeare's Othello, you have heard that before, because Shakespeare was the one who came up with that saying. Envy, the green-eyed monster. And where did he get that from? Believe it or not, he got it from observing cats. Anybody have a house cat or anything like that? We used to have some house cats. And house cats, typically, not always, but typically they'll have green eyes. And if you've ever seen a house cat catch a mouse or a bird or something like that, they always play with it before they finally kill it and eat it. It's kind of a cruel process if you ever watched, but the victim will think it's going to get away, and then the cat pounces once again and brings it back into its grasp until finally, after being toyed with for so long, it succumbs to the punishment that the cat has inflicted upon it. And Shakespeare says that that's what envy is like. That's what envy does to other people. And so we should really be concerned about the sin of envy if Shakespeare knew enough to name it the green-eyed monster. Well, let's think a little bit about envy and jealousy for a minute, because we get these two things confused in our culture today. A lot of times we'll talk about envy with the word jealousy, and maybe we'll say jealousy when we actually mean envy, and there is a difference between them. Envy is always sinful, but jealousy is not always sinful. In fact, in the Old Testament, in Exodus, book of Exodus and the law of Moses, it's reiterated several times that God is a jealous God. And what does he mean by that? Well, God means that he is jealous of what belongs to him. He wants what belongs to him, and he doesn't want anyone else to get what belongs to him. And so he was jealous of his people. He didn't want them going and worshiping false gods. He didn't want them becoming idolaters. He wanted them worshiping the one true and living God. He was jealous. It's okay for a husband to be appropriately jealous of his wife, and for a wife to be appropriately jealous of her husband. Now, sometimes jealousy can run amok, in which case it can become a problem. But my wife is my wife, and she is no other's wife. And so it's appropriate for me to be jealous of my wife. But there are some things that we shouldn't be jealous of course, possessions and things that have no eternal value. We shouldn't be jealous of those things. But envy doesn't desire that which you already have. It desires that which you do not have. And so when you're looking at something with envy, you're looking at something that belongs properly to someone else. Sometimes the Bible uses the word covetousness, and it means something similar to envy when it uses that word. And so we frequently say jealousy, like, I'm jealous that he got this job, or I'm jealous that she has such beautiful hair, or, fill in the blank, We use that word jealousy to mean envy frequently in our society today. But we need to remember that envy is always a sin, whereas jealousy is not. Well, let's think about envy tonight and think about the different attributes, I should say, of what envy is. First of all, let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verses 1 through 10. 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verses 1 through 10, we get a good example of envy here in the example of Saul and David. 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verses 1 through 10. It says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was told that he made his son judges over Israel, the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice." I hope I got the right chapter here. Oh, yes, okay. So let's back up. We'll talk about David and Saul maybe a little bit later. But right now we'll talk about this. But look at what happens here in the rest of these verses. "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.' But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also.'" So envy begins, and this is a good example of envy, because envy begins with looking at yourself and making comparisons with others. All right? So you look at your own life and you say, "Well, I don't have this, and I don't have that, and I'm lacking this, or I sure could use a new coat, or I could use a new car. And look at so-and-so down the road. He's got all the finest things. And what did he ever do to deserve all that?" That's envy talking. And here are the children of Israel looking at themselves, and they're saying, "Well, we're different from all the nations around us. We don't have a king like they do. They've got kings, and you know what? We want a king too. So give us a king. We've got these judges, and sometimes their kids, they don't behave right, and so we'll use whatever excuse that we can find to get what we want." And that's kind of what's going on here in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And so envy starts with believing that I'm deficient in some way. And then those who are ambitious with their envy look at others and see what they lack, and they start wanting the things that others have. Now, this can be a tremendous amount of different things. It can be beauty, intelligence, affability, acceptance with others. It can have personal characteristics. You can envy that. You can envy possessions, such as people's wealth or or affluence, their houses, their lands, their cars, all of those things. And a lot of times, envy is not satisfied. You know, when when you're envious, you think, well, if I just had this, then I would be satisfied. And then you get it, and you're not satisfied because there's always something else that someone else has that you don't have that you're going to want. And that's envy. Its basic fundamental problem is comparing yourself with other people. Comparing your internal life with other people's external life. And that's not a fair comparison, and it never will be. Because you're always going to see your own deficiencies and their proficiencies. And that's never going to be a fair comparison. But that's what envy does. Look at Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 4 here. Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 4. And there, the wise man says, again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. Vanity and grasping for the wind. That's all envy is. And you know, envy develops itself further. And this is where it gets into the cat-like behavior that we talked about earlier. Because envy leverages things like justice and fairness to try to rationalize what it lacks. Why, it's not fair for that person to have what they have when I've worked just as hard as they have and I don't have what they have. It's not fair. And so, you know, in politics, that is used tremendously to sway people to one political point of view or another. And you can get caught up in that very easily, thinking that, well, if I only get my candidate elected into office, then things are going to be fair again. And I'll get what is due to me. And of course, that doesn't ever happen if you really look at it and think about it. But envy uses that argument. It uses the idea that I deserve what other people have. Because a lot of times envy will combine with pride, and it will say, I deserve it because I am better than they are. They've worked hard, but I've worked harder. They've done well, but I should be doing better. Why? Well, because I'm a better person. I'm more moral than they are, or I'm more righteous than they are, or I go to church more than they are. And envy can even use things like that to rationalize its behavior. And so there's another argument that's used to justify envy, and that's the equality rationalization. You know, it's not fair, but things should be equal. Everything should be equal with one another. And if it was just equal, at least, then it would be fair, right? And so they leverage that, or envy leverages that kind of thinking as well. And envy, because it makes these comparisons, is a sin of the intellect. It's not as if envy is sitting there doing something that is sinful. Like sometimes you have these lists in the Bible, right? And you get things like adultery and fornication and theft and corruption and all kinds of things that you put your finger on, right? And say, no, I know that's sinful and we shouldn't be doing that. Envy's not like that. It's very sneaky. It's a sin of the mind. It's a sin that sneaks up on us. It makes false comparisons. It tries to use self-justifications to support the intellect. and it plots against others. And it plots for their failure. It plots for their demise because it thinks, well, if I can't have what they have, then they're at least not going to have what they have. And that's envy and how it works. Well, envy distorts reality. Look at 1 Samuel 8, verses 11 and 12 here. Listen to what is going on here. So here's what the Lord, and just looking at this. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. Verse 11, and he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen. And some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make the weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officers and servants, and he will take your male servants and your female servants, your finest young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Now listen to verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Envy distorts reality. That's the second point. Envy distorts reality. Now, everything that Samuel said came true with all the kings that ruled over Israel and Judah. And yet, they wouldn't believe what Samuel said. Envy builds a house of cards, more or less. Things will be better if I just get what I want. That's what envy says. Here, the people are saying, well, if you would just have a king over us, it'll be so much better. And Samuel is saying, nope, nope. If you get a king, all these horrible things are going to happen. No, it won't, Samuel. It's going to be better. You just wait and see. Well, we see what happened when Israel got a king to rule over them. And so, envy uses these elaborate rationalizations to justify itself. It makes this mental effort, and it appeals to a person's pride. Builds this house of cards that appears to be stable. And that's all then that a person who is envious can see, is that house of cards. You ever try to build a house of cards before, or with dominoes or something like that, and it's so unstable, But when you're focusing on it, you're just like, that's all you can see, right? And you're like, stay away, everybody stay away, because I'm building this card house, and if you even blow the wrong direction, it's going to collapse it, And you're just so focused on that, you don't see anything else. Envy is like that. Envy doesn't see others for what they truly are. Look at Samuel's warning about the king here and what the king will do to the people. Did they want to see that? No, they didn't want to see that. They only wanted to see the things that they thought looked good. Envy fails to appreciate the legitimate good that other people do. For example, if you're envious of someone, all you can see is the bad things that they do. Why, he's such a terrible person. He has all these stuff, but then he's a terrible person. Look at the horrible things that he does or she does. Envy can't see the good in other people. Envy fails to see the real problems that are a part of other people's lives In some ways, envy only sees what it wants to see. It only sees that new car or that big house or that education or the beauty or whatever it is. Envy only sees those things. It doesn't see how many hours of work that person had to be away from his family to get all of those things, or the sacrifices that they made, whether good or bad, that those things came from, or the hours of spending in front of a mirror to look as good as that person looks. It doesn't see all of that. It only sees the externals. And so when we mistrust others like that, and it creates mistrust, it creates problems. It can't see behind the curtain that we put on our lives. Everybody has a public life and a private life, right? And our public life is out there for everyone to see, and most of the time we just let them see the things we want them to see. And then the private life is the life that we have, a lot of things that we don't want people to see. And so envy only sees the public, it never sees the private. And so it paints a much better picture of a person's life than what's really real. Proverbs 23 and verse 17. Look at that. Proverbs 23 verse 17. Do not let your heart envy sinners, but be zealous for the fear of the Lord all day. Do not let your heart envy sinners. And who's a sinner? Everybody. Think about that for a minute. In other words, don't envy anyone. The contrast here is not between a sinner and say a righteous person. The contrast here is between a sinner and what? The fear of the Lord. Now think about that for a minute. Because the Lord is always righteous, but men are not. And then envy, it distorts reality by not looking at a person's self as a person truly is. And that means that you end up not even seeing the good things in your own life that you do have. Your focus is only on what you don't have, what you lack, and how miserable you are because of that. And so you never learn to appreciate the good things that you do have. And that's why contentment is a great weapon in the battle against envy. Because if you're content with what you have, it makes you appreciate what you have. And envy does just the opposite. It only sees your own failures, disappointments, problems, and shortcomings. And it cannot appreciate the good things that one has. Envy does not count its blessings. Envy is not faithful. Envy is blind to the acceptance of friends and family. Envy robs us of joy, peace, identity, mercy, grace, and love. And that's why James says what he says about envy here. It is demonic. It is devilish, some translations say. So there is nothing about envy that should be desired. It does not come from God. It comes from the devil. And that's James' clear message here about envy. And there is no love in envy. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4 talks about how love is many things, but love does not envy. And then look at Proverbs 14 and verse 30. And after thinking about all of these things that envy does, consider what it says here. A sound heart is life to the body, but envy is rottenness to the bones. Envy just eats and eats and eats and corrupts and corrupts and corrupts until you have nothing left but a bitter person who can't count his blessings, who can't see the good in his own life, who's just constantly looking at other things that he doesn't have, constantly. And it develops into anger and resentment and so many things. And you wonder why people behave the way they behave, especially, just think about politics and look at the way people behave in politics sometimes and how angry they are and bitter they are and resentful they are. Why? Because they are so envious. That's the explanation. Sometimes we say, I don't know why those people behave like that. God does. It's envy. That's why they behave like that. And then finally, envy destroys its victims. So envy makes comparisons between ourselves and others. Envy distorts reality. And envy destroys its victims. Look at 1 Samuel 18 here in verses 6 through 30. Now we're going to get into Saul and David. 1 Samuel 18, 6 through 30. So the people went out to the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went over the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth. And I'm having trouble seeing. The mule, okay, which was under him went on. So this is David and Absalom. I was thinking about David and Saul, and David heard that song, that Saul has slain his thousands, David is tens of thousands, and Saul was envious because of that. But this is David and Absalom here. So, and as we keep reading down through verse 30, we see that so much is going on here. And you remember Absalom, who was so envious of David and his possessions and his kingship. Well, envy places the blame on others instead of self. It doesn't want to see the truth about self, and so it's always blaming other people. A lot of times envy is held so secretly that nobody knows that it's going on, and they wouldn't believe that someone was truly envious. The shame would be too much to bear. Galatians chapter 5, verse 26 says, "Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." And it shows that there's a relationship then between envy and pride. Envy breeds mistrust, paranoia, and enmity. And that's what was happening between Absalom and David, specifically on Absalom's part. Envy cannot see the pure motives of others. And when envy develops, it becomes paranoid of everything that goes on around it. Look at 1 Timothy 6 and verses 3 through 4. 1 Timothy 6, verses 3 through 4. "If anyone teaches otherwise and does not consent to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords with godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but is obsessed with disputes and arguments over words, from which come envy, strife, reviling, evil suspicions." So notice what Paul starts with here. He is proud. Envy comes from pride. It comes with the pride of thinking that I'm better than that person or whoever it is, or whatever it is. And so therefore, I should have better things than that person. better education, better looks, better possessions, whatever it might be. And when envy sees that it can't get those things, the pride steps up and it seeks to destroy the other one. You know, there's a case in Boston. We'll end with this here at the end of our lesson. But a couple of years ago, there was a woman who murdered, supposedly, her best friend, and then, I don't mean to be gory or anything, but then she was pregnant at the time. I'm sure this was in the news here, as it was made national news, and took the baby and then ran off to Oklahoma. Well, that's ultimately the fruits of envy right there. She wanted her own child, but she couldn't have children. And so she did. She went to the ultimate extreme of robbing her own friend of her child. Ultimately, the child passed away also. And trying to satisfy her envious desires. That's the end of envy. Look at Mark 15 and verse 10. Mark 15 and verse 10. This is the end of envy. Pilate perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Now, what did they do? They wanted Jesus dead because they envied him. And that's what envy ends in. One more scripture, Proverbs 24:17. Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. Why? Because that's the seed of envy. Seed of envy. We don't want that within our lives. Wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? Proverbs 27, verse 4. Envy is the green-eyed monster. It sees what it wants, goes after it, plays with its victim, and ultimately ends up destroying it. And self. Great warnings here in James about envy. Thank you for your kind attention tonight.